It really is a rare privilege for me to be at least introducing one of the most outstanding members of a congressional delegation that I had had the privilege to serve with. There was, in the early days, when camaraderie was the byword in Washington, a dinner party called the Tuesday Night Club. Two of those members I had lunch with today, and so this is the Monday morning lunch club. But Dick Durbin, who came to Washington after having exercised the privilege of running for office in other areas, and joined us in the congressional delegation, after serving for a couple of years, wanted to get on the Appropriations Committee. And I had no reason in the world, except that he wasn't from Chicago, to be against him. And so, in the contest of selected seats, Durbin said, I can do a good job there. I said, Dick, I don't doubt that at all. I said, but appropriation seats are usually reserved for members of the delegation that live in Chicago. And he said, well, I think that's almost discriminatory. I said, well, it's just too bad, isn't it? But anyway, I said, Dick, I'm being serious now. I want you to understand something. The responsibility of putting members on assignment committees is one that I treasured. As a matter of fact, I think I ran for the office on Ways and Means Committee because at the time it was the Steering and Policy Committee of the Congress of the United States, and there were only 15 of us. But I said, Dick, I want to get a commitment from you. He said, what's that? I said, I want you, if you're going to get on appropriations, to remember that priorities are important. And one of the priorities will be, can I help Chicago? Well, I thought that was a selfish request. And I heard his acquiescence very quietly. And Dick Durbin did get on the Appropriations Committee, but strangely enough, we had 5 votes to put him on, and it was a tie every time. And then one of my colleagues walked over to me and said, Dan, I think this individual who is in the Illinois delegation is not supporting you. I meandered over to the individual that was not supporting. And I said, if Durbin is not on the Appropriations Committee in the next vote, you will not be in Congress in the next election. Appropriations Committee for Dick Durbin. At any rate, really, I was so proud because Dick is an energetic, aggressive individual who has done immeasurably well on both in the House of Representatives and certainly in the Senate. And I'm certainly proud to be associated with him, to have had a little bit to do in his rise and his accomplishments. Leon Panetta, who is going to be your principal speaker this afternoon, was the biggest pain in the ankle that you can imagine, because he was on the Budget Committee and he was chairman of the Budget Committee, and he always came to my office and said, I'm not going to tell you how to do this. I don't want to tell you how to do this, Dan. But can you give me a number? I said, that's all you're going to get. You're just going to get a number, because the Ways and Means Committee is going to work out the financial destiny of this country as far as I'm concerned. And I got no problem with you, Dan. I've got no problem with you. Well, you can't keep a good man down, and you all realize the heights that Leon Panetta has risen to. But at this time, over my objection, really, because Dick came to me and said, I'm running for the Senate. I says, you are like hell. He says, Dan, I'm running for the Senate. You haven't any idea what it's like in the House of Representatives being in the minority. I said, but Dick, the Appropriations Committee, he says, you don't mean anything in the minority on the Appropriations Committee. So over and above my consulting, he ran, and I think I voted for him. An outstanding young man, a credit to the Illinois delegation, an outstanding citizen of this state, a man whom I've been proud to work with and who I'm proud of today, Dick Durbin, our senator.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The chairman did not embellish that story because I never would have made it on the House Appropriations Committee were it not for his fine efforts along with our mutual friend Marty Russo, who made sure that I did win by one vote in this critical contest. And I went to him afterwards and said, I want to thank you. And he said, I want you to remember one thing: Chicago, Chicago, Chicago. And I did my best, and it was great working with him. And I hope as you hear me speak and then the man I'm about to introduce, you will understand how much, what an enjoyable time it was for all of us to not only be part of government together, but also to be such close friends. A lot of politicians get up and throw that around, but this is for real. Once a week, without fail, sometimes twice a week, we would get together for memorable dinners, eating a lot of pasta, drinking a little wine, and having a great time regaling one another with stories about things that were going on and about to go on. And it was one of the better parts of public service to be part of that group and that culture. And I'm honored to be introduced by my good friend and mentor, Dan Rostenkowski. I learned a lot about politics, political science 101, 202, 303, and beyond from this great fella, and I'm glad he's with us today. Now let me tell you about our guest of honor and very briefly, because we want to get him up here. He has an interesting background. For those of you who were listening to Jay talk about bipartisanship, you may be interested to know that Leon Panetta began his political career as a Republican. He first went to Washington in 1966, served as legislative assistant to a senator from California, Tom Kuechel, who was the Senate Minority Whip. In 1969, he became special counsel under another Republican administration, working in the Department of HEW. After that, he was chosen to be the executive assistant to Mayor John Lindsay of New York. And after that experience, went back to California. And I think that was the moment probably in his life when Leon, sitting on the Big Sur, gazing out into the waves, decided that it was time for a change. He then set out to prove that you can be born a Republican, but you can be born again. Because in 1977, he was elected U.S. Congressman from California as a Democrat and served with great distinction in the House of Representatives. They gave him the heavy lifting, a lot of assignments that were very tough, one of the toughest being chairman of the Budget Committee, which he handled so well. I was a member of that committee, and I know exactly what he did there. And then when the new president, Bill Clinton, came in, he turned to him for one of the most important jobs in Washington, head of the Office of Management and Budgeting, where all the decisions, the final decisions are made, where you put the money and the ideas together. And without that approval, nothing goes forward. In a short period of time, the president needed someone as his chief of staff who could not only bring experience in government, but a good relationship with Congress to the job, and he called on Leon Panetta again, and he served with great distinction in that capacity. When he finally left the White House and went back to California, we wondered if he would run again, but he and Sylvia had other plans. They put together the Leon and Sylvia Panetta Institute for Public Policy based at California State University, Monterey Bay. And if you've ever been out there, you can understand why they hate to leave Monterey and to visit any place else in the country. But he has made that an exciting part of the governmental discussion and dialogue as he continues to be deeply involved in public policy. This is a man whom I know very well, and I introduce as a friend and say to you that you have in Leon Panetta a perfect example of a man who has dedicated his life to public service but never forgot the values that brought him to this job. Let's all give a big Chicago welcome to Leon Panetta.
Thank you very much, Dick Durbin, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the invitation and the ability to address the City Club here. I'm honored for a number of reasons. First of all, because it gives me an opportunity to renew some old friendships. Dick Durbin is someone who was a dear friend and continues to be a dear friend, someone who we used to share great food and great talk with in Washington. And he was also a member of the Budget Committee and somebody that I work with from healthcare issues to agricultural issues to issues affecting Illinois. And he really is someone who, again, you know, Washington, there are an awful lot of people in those 535 members that are part of the Congress. But people who exercise their conscience and really try to make decisions on what they believe is right sometimes are few and far between. But Dick Durbin has always done that. And in doing so, he has represented the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, and very frankly, the American people in an outstanding fashion. You ought to be very proud of Senator Durbin. Dan Rostenkowski. Talk about getting a kick in the ass when you're a young member trying to figure out where where you have to go and what you have to do. He was a great mentor and a strong chairman, and it's true. This country will not see another chairman of the Ways and Means Committee like Dan Rostenkowski because, again, he was tough, but what he did was in the interest of the country. And I can remember, in those days we were fighting deficits, and it was not easy because same impulse to go out and spend and do whatever you had to do to try to please your constituents. But this guy understood that the first order of business was to discipline ourselves because it was important to our future. And without his help, very frankly, we would have never passed an economic plan. He provided great leadership as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. But more importantly, he was someone who always stood for good policy for this country. Ab Mikva. So Ab Mikva, worked with him at the White House Consul's office, actually was involved in bringing him on as White House Consul in the White House. And he's another person who, great integrity and someone that I truly respect for his service to the country. So this is a chance to meet some very good friends and to be able to share some memories. I'm also honored because this great city of Chicago. Where the hell else can you go and have a lunch like this? To come to an Italian restaurant as an Italian and have pasta for lunch. I mean, most of the time you're on rubber chicken circuit. So it's nice to be here in Chicago where you know how to eat and know how to enjoy food. I feel comfortable because my parents actually ran a little Italian restaurant in Monterey, California. This is the crossroads for immigrants, as we all know. And my Italian parents, both of whom were immigrants to this country, actually came through Chicago. My father worked here, and then they moved west and eventually wound up in Monterey, California. And that's where I was born. And I'm now with my wife, Sylvia. We make our home out in California. As Dick knows, and Dan, every weekend I used to fly back to California, just as they did here to Illinois. And the reason you do that is not only because you want to get back home, but because, frankly, getting out of Washington is important to maintaining your perspective on what's right. You lose your perspective in Washington if you stay there too long. And you've got to get out and talk to people and see the country. And I did that every weekend. I went back to California, and I really enjoyed that opportunity. When I became director of OMB, I couldn't do it as often, but I did. And then when I became chief of staff to the president, it's impossible, obviously, to be able to do that. But at the time the president asked me to become chief of staff, I said, Mr. President, I'll do this, and I'll take you through the re-election. But then I want to go home to California. That's my home, and I want to be able to move on. And I did that. Right after the re-election and the inauguration, my wife and I moved back to California. Now, I can be accused of an awful lot in politics in my almost 30 years of politics. But one thing I can't be accused of is having a bad sense of timing when to get the hell out of Washington. I thank the guardian angel who told me it was time to go back to California every night. Chicago is a great town. I was actually Grand Marshal of the Columbus Day Parade, so I had a chance to visit with the Italian community here, and I really enjoyed that. But I'm also honored here because I pay tribute to the leadership of this town. Mayor Daley is an outstanding mayor of the city of Chicago. Remember when I worked for John Lindsay and the mayor's father put together a big city coalition, and I had the opportunity to work with his father and saw what tough leadership is all about, strong leadership is all about. And his son certainly follows in his footsteps in the leadership he provides for this town. And whether it's Dick Durbin or Dan Rostenkowski or Ab Mikva or other members of the delegation, or the people of this town of Chicago and of Illinois, you provide strong leadership because you care about this country and you care about your families, and most importantly, you care about the American way of life. All of that is being tested today in a very real way. We are being tested as a nation, as a people. The attack on America that we went through a few weeks ago was not an attack on a military objective, and it was not an attack on people in uniform, and it was not an attack that was based on trying to gain an advantage on a battlefield. It was an attack that was aimed at our will as a nation, at our way of life as a nation, at our democracy. And the key to confronting that is to show them and the rest of the world that this country will never lose its will or its leadership or its freedom or its democracy, regardless of who tries to attack us. Our forefathers, and I respect their genius more and more every day, as you see our system of government tested from time to time. Our forefathers understood what it meant to try to develop a system of government that would be able to withstand the crises, that would be able to withstand the tremendous pressures that often confront us as a free people. They knew what they didn't want to do. They didn't want to centralize power in any one branch of government. They didn't want a king. They didn't want a king parliament. They didn't want a star chamber court. They knew that absolute power would corrupt absolutely. And so what they did in creating this remarkable system of three separate but equal branches of government and a system of checks and balances was designed essentially to limit power. So they created, in a sense, almost a paradox. Because on the one hand, they wanted a strong, new, dynamic democracy. But at the same time, they limited the powers of that democracy. So it was a prescription, obviously, for making sure that we limited power, but in many ways, it's also a prescription for gridlock. So what was the key? The key in their mind is that people would exercise leadership in confronting the challenges that face them, and that people would be willing to sit down and debate, yes, to have differences, to feel strongly about their positions, but ultimately to arrive at consensus, at compromise, and move the nation forward. That was the key to breaking that paradox. They believed, in Madison's words, that a wise and virtuous people would elect wise and virtuous leaders. And for 200 years, we have, in fact, been blessed with leadership, good leadership. Oftentimes, it's been tested by crisis, oftentimes tested by human failings of those that are elected. But in the end, we have moved the nation forward, and we have made our nation better for it. That has always been the goal. I've always felt that my parents, the reason they came to this country is, not because they were just simply looking for the opportunity that was here. I think deep down what they wanted was a better life for their children. And they knew they could give their children a better life here. It is to make our society, our democracy better for our children. That is the American dream. Today, as we are in this new century, and we face these new challenges and these new opportunities, I guess the question is, will leadership be able to respond and confront these new challenges? Will we be better as a people in confronting this crisis? That's the fundamental question. Before September 11th, people struggling to kind of define what the century would be about, some thought this would be the information age because of the tremendous developments in technology on information. Some today, after September 11th, might call this the age of terrorism. A few months ago, I attended a conference in which a futurist spoke to try to describe the period of time that we are in as a nation. Futurists are interesting people. My Italian father would have probably said a futurist is somebody who can't get a job in the present, so wants to talk about the future. These are people who are kind of archaeologists that want to look at the present and try to determine what history will say about our time. And his conclusion was that this is really that we are no longer in the age of information. We are in the age of paradox in the United States of America. And he referred to our personal habits, the fact that, for example, we were into exercising and yet eating fast food. We care about the quality of our air, and yet we're buying larger and larger cars, larger and larger gas guzzlers. Those were the kinds of things he was talking about. But when I thought about it, the reality is we are in the age of paradox. There's probably no state that represents that paradox more than my own state of California. I mean, on one hand, we are a tremendously diverse and creative society. We've got very strong interests in our economy that range from entertainment to agriculture. We're the 5th largest economy in the world in California. There's no question that that we have a tremendous amount of promise and productivity in California, and yet the paradox is, for all of that strength, we have a hell of a time keeping the lights on. We had rolling blackouts. We have an infrastructure crisis, not just in energy, but in water, in transportation, in education, in healthcare, and housing. And so the leadership in California is struggling to resolve those contradictions because they, in effect, threaten our way of life in that state. But there are other paradoxes. Our military power. We are, without question, the strongest military power in the world. There is no other country that has the power of the United States of America. Look at the sophistication of our technology: cruise missiles, stealth bombers, stealth fighters, satellite targeting, carriers that wander the entire world. I mean, never in history, probably since the British Navy patrolled the seas on behalf of the British Empire, has there been so much power in one country. And yet the paradox is obvious. And for all of that power, we're still struggling to try to find peace in the Middle East and Kosovo. And a small group of terrorists were able not only to attack our embassies and our ships, but they attacked our own buildings in our own country. And not only that, they attacked the very symbol of the strength of our military, the Pentagon itself. And so the lesson is that for all of that power, it is not enough unless we have the wisdom and the understanding and the vigilance and the leadership to provide real security. Our economy is another paradox. Now, make no mistake about it, the United States of America, even with the problems we confront now, we have the strongest economy in the world. Strongest economy in the world. We've got the best workers. We are productive. We are creative. Our fundamentals are good in terms of our economy. We have a balanced budget. We were looking at a projected surplus of $5.6 trillion over the next 10 years. And you know the paradox here. In a matter of just a few months, we have had the most significant turnaround in our economy than we've seen perhaps in generations. And the reality is, right now, as we speak, it's not only the non-Social Security surplus which has disappeared, but I think there's a very strong possibility that we will go into deficit spending in terms of the unified budget at the federal level in 2002, 2003, 2004, and 2005. That's a reality. And there's a real danger that we may be back to borrow and spend. In addition to that, we obviously are seeing not only possibility of a recession here, but a worldwide recession that will impact on our economy. There are efforts to try to deal with that, an economic stimulus, $40 billion for New York, and for dealing with terrorism, $15 billion for the airlines. There's talk now of a $100 billion package as a stimulus to our economy. And all of that at a time when we also have to think that 77 million baby boomers are going to retire soon and go after Social Security and Medicare in a way that could threaten the stability of those funds in the future. So we now face an economic crisis that challenges leadership at every level and can impact on every family in this nation. Technology is another one of those paradoxes. Again, we are very innovative. We're so creative in our computers, our biotechnology. I have a son, one of my 3 sons is now at the Mayo Clinic doing research. He's a cardiologist. And he tells me they now have they're working on the ability to inject cells into clogged arteries to provide a permanent solution to that terrible disease that we often confront. And information flies across this country. I can't believe in the last 20 years that we've been around, information now flies. Let me share with you a story. When I went to the White House as Chief of Staff, I wanted to see the Situation Room to see whether it really looked like that scene from Dr. Strangelove. And the Situation Room in the White House under the West Wing is not really that big. It's actually a relatively small room, small conference table. But I said to the person who was showing me around, show me where the center of information is here in the White House. Because surely we're in touch with our satellites and our agents. Where is that center of information? And the military person who was showing me around said, it's over here, Mr. Panetta. He brought me over to a corner, and there were 2 guys dressed in uniform watching CNN News. It's true, watching CNN News. They tell me they've added MSNBC since I've left. Another story that Dick knows, and this is not, one of the things I don't miss about being Chief of Staff are the calls you get at 2 o'clock or 2:30 in the morning, because it's never good news. And I got a call soon after I became Chief of Staff. Actually, somebody reminded me that it was around September 11th that it happened. Secret Service agent said, Mr. Panetta, I'm sorry to wake you, but I got to tell you something. I said, what is it? He said, a plane just went into the White House. I said, you got to be kidding me. I mean, you can imagine, I mean, my first reaction was the same as you have now, which is, why didn't somebody blow that damn thing out of the air? And I said to him, I said, well, was it a DC-10? Was it a 747? He said, no, no, no. It was a small plane, went up against the White House. We don't think it did much damage. And I said, but wait a minute. Is this an attempt on the president's life? Is this a group of terrorists that are creating a diversion? I mean, is there dynamite in that airplane? Is it going to blow? What? And there was this pause, and the Secret Service agent said, well, according to CNN News. I said, no, 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 you don't understand. I want you to get off your butt and go there and see what's in that damn plane. Information systems now not only impact on our politics, but they impact really on policy as well. But for all of that technology, I guess the paradox is that we still have a hell of a time teaching third graders how to read. 50% of the kids going into the California State University system in my state need remedial education. And the key is that you can't just draw your values from a computer. It takes good parents, it takes a good community, it takes people in churches, in the religious community, it takes everybody who cares about children to really make our society strong. I'll share with you one other paradox, which is something that, certainly before September 11th bothered me a great deal, which is our democracy. We are the beacon to the world of what self-government and liberty is all about. Just travel any place in the world, and people look to this country for the greatness of our system of government. But the paradox is that in this last election, less than 50% of the people voted. And in the election before that, 64% of the people registered and qualified to vote did not turn out to vote. So a third of the people decided who would be our leadership. And the concern I have is that it's affecting our young people. My wife and I run this institute in California, the Panetta Institute. And we do polls on attitudes of young people towards government because we care about public service and young people. Let me just share with you some of the results of that poll. 73% of those polled said they would never choose a career in public life. This is college students throughout the United States. 73% never choose a career in public life. 94% said they did not volunteer for any political campaign in this last election, for any political campaign. 80% said they had never had a conversation with an adult about getting involved in public life. Now, I have to tell you, my Italian parents, they weren't bright, they weren't, college educated, but boy, did they used to say to my brother and I, you've got to give something back to this country. You have a duty to this country to give something back. Somehow that conversation isn't taking place very much anymore. 86%, the good news is that 86% will volunteer at the local level, and they care about issues, they care about education, they care about women's rights, they care about civil rights. But there's a disconnect. They do not, in their minds, connect what they care about with leadership in Washington, with policies that are conducted at the national level. There's a disconnect. At the Center for National Policy, we're trying to establish information on what government does in each congressional district so that people understand that there is a connection between what you believe in and the people that we elect to office. And yet, as I said, there is that disconnect. Now, perhaps after September 11th, maybe this has all changed, and I hope that it has. Because crisis alone is not enough. It will take leadership to guide us, to educate our children, to move about freely, to travel where we want to go, to work as hard as we can for our families, to worship as we desire, and to be able to enjoy and embrace our freedoms. But the greatest threat to our way of life is uncertainty and insecurity today. And you cannot have freedom without security, and you cannot have security without freedom. If people are worried about the next flight they're going to take, if they're worried about the next building they're going to go into, if they're worried about their job and their business, the water they drink, their hope for the future, their very freedoms, if they're worried about that, then the American life as we know it will have fundamentally changed, and the terrorists will have won. So the point is this, that the first responsibility of leadership is to restore security to the American way of life. That's their first responsibility. How do you do that? Well, let me just mention a few steps that I think are important. First of all, you need strong bipartisan leadership of the President and the Congress working together and of both parties working together. I commend the President and I commend the leadership of the Congress for their willingness to work together. The unity they have shown since September 11th is wonderful for this country and for the issues that they're trying to deal with. But to last, that will be a challenge. And in the wake of a crisis, it's one thing, but as the months go by, it's another thing. If it's going to last, the President will have to confront, oftentimes, his own leadership. And the Democratic leadership may have to confront their own rank and file. But they have to continue to try to find consensus if we're going to be able to restore security. Secondly, we have to recognize that this war on terrorism is, in effect, a new Cold War. Because what it's going to take is not only care and a methodical approach, but what we've got to do is contain it, to suffocate it, and to ultimately have terrorism fall of its own weight. Yes, it's going to have to be confronted on a number of levels: the military, the intelligence level, our diplomatic level, law enforcement, financial. But in the end, it will demand that we be patient and that we be careful as we try to address that threat. The last point I want to make is in restoring our economy, because very frankly, we cannot conduct a war on terrorism unless we have a strong economy in this country. It's not only important to the security of our families and the security of our nation, but as I said, it's important to the very war that we want to conduct. Now, while a stimulus package may be needed to deal with the present situation, and I think there is need to try to address some real problems, I guess I just would remind everyone that there is no silver bullet that can immediately turn our economy around. There just isn't. What we've learned from the past is that a stimulus package that is not carefully thought out can do more harm than good. The worst threat to our economy right now is that the combination of a weakened economy, plus what I think, frankly, was a poorly designed tax cut that adds even greater costs in the out years, plus obviously, the new threats that we are facing in terms of having to spend on security and other needs, that the combination of that will jeopardize our long-term fiscal position, and that it could very well not only return us to borrow and spend, but could increase interest rates in the long term that could undermine a strong economy. We have got to worry about our long-term fiscal health in this country. So the principles I would recommend to my friends in the Congress and to the President: any package should be temporary, not permanent. It should have an immediate impact on consumers, particularly those at the middle and lower income level. It should provide an immediate stimulus to business to invest now, not in the future, but now. And it should not provide any hitchhikers or be a Christmas tree for everybody's favorite little package. In the end, it has to focus on returning long-term fiscal health to this country, which means that we either review that tax cut or we pay for this package in some kind of meaningful way. As I said, this is a time of great opportunity and great challenge. I think there is great hope out there in terms of the future of our country. But we do confront these paradoxes that I think threaten our security for the future. And to a large extent, we have to follow the guidance of our forefathers. We have to provide strong leadership that finds consensus. There's an old story that I often tell because it's so appropriate, of the rabbi and the priest who decided they'd get to know each other a little better. And one evening they went to a boxing match. And just before the bell rang, one of the boxers made the sign of the cross. And the rabbi nudged the priest and he said, "What does that mean?" The priest said, "It doesn't mean a damn thing if he can't fight." Ladies and gentlemen, we bless ourselves with the hope that everything's going to be okay in this country. But very frankly, it doesn't mean a damn thing unless we're willing to fight for it. Fight to restore that American dream. Fight to make this country better for the future. But most importantly, fight to ensure that we are always a government of, by, and for all people. Thank you very much.
There'll be a few questions, and for all you political leaders, Monterey is a couple of thousand miles away, and lucky for some of you. Mr. Panetta, you could have a career here, by the way. I want you to know that. Alderman Notaras.
Do you think we've reached the time where we should address the issue of whether or not we should require everyone at the age of 18 for 2 years compulsory government service?
Yes, I'm happy to repeat it. Do you think we've reached a time when we ought to require of young people 2 years of some kind of compulsory service? I am a believer. I am a very strong believer in some kind of national service system for young people. You know, I know that it can't at this point in time be mandatory only because of the nature of the politics of doing that. But I do think that if we provided an encouragement so that every young person for 2 years would serve in some capacity, either in the military or on conservation or education or working in healthcare or working with juvenile delinquents or working in some capacity in which for 2 years they would serve and we would virtually provide them with a GI Bill to provide those benefits. I think that would be important for this country. Look, I served 2 years in the Army. I mean, how was I inspired to public service? I was inspired by my parents. I was inspired by 2 years of service to this country, which taught me what it meant to work together for a common mission and work with others in a unified and disciplined way. And it also taught me, very frankly, to pay attention to role models and their encouragement to be involved. John Kennedy said it was important to give something back to this country. So those are the kinds of inspirations that I think are important for young people. They need to know that. And I mention this national service system to audiences, and they respond. I think it is something we have to consider in this country.
Questions for the council? So many titles, I know. Why don't you go to the microphone, because it's on television, and right over there, that way they can get it. Spelt it out, look it up.
The Attorney General is wanting Congress to give more authority for surveillance, et cetera, in the name of being able to fight terrorism. I'm concerned about that from the
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm convinced that that if leaders in the Congress and the President kind of take their time, and don't panic into enacting things that we do, you know, out of crisis, but enact those things that are important in terms of law enforcement and legitimate law enforcement needs, that we can find that balance between what we need to do to fight terrorism and protecting the liberties that are important to us. I honestly do think that we can find that balance. Look, part of the problem in dealing with this terrorist threat, very frankly, is not so much a question of whether or not, you know, we have to surrender our liberties and freedoms. There's a lot of inefficiency and ineffective intelligence that went into this. And I'm not so sure that's a question of whether or not you can, in effect have to invade everybody's privacy, but you do have to improve our capabilities and the people that are involved in that capability to make sure it's done right. Now, Are there some legitimate things that I think they're asking for? Yeah, I think the fact that people use cell phones and that we need to make sure that we can track those cell phones and terrorists, not just in one location, but several, I think that makes sense. I think probably the most onerous one is obviously the one that would hold immigrants, without any kind of time frame. And that concerns me, and I understand at least that they're talking about limiting that as well. So I think the most important thing, and I have to give credit to the president right now, President seems to me right now to be careful, not only in dealing with the terrorist threat and trying to locate where these terrorists are, but also in dealing with these kinds of issues. And as long as they're careful, as long as they discuss these things, then I'm confident we'll find the right answers.
Mr. Mazur, step right up.
Over the last week or so, the Congress has voted a huge bailout for the airlines to help them out. At the same time, thousands upon thousands of airline employees have lost their jobs. From your perspective as a quote-unquote Washington insider, could you share with us what some of the thinking in that regard may have been?
I probably should throw that to Dick Durbin because he was there at the time. My understanding is that the Democrats did raise this issue, and I think there were some Republicans that raised the issue as well because obviously had well over 100,000 people being laid off at the time you're talking about providing this package of support to the airlines. The concern was obviously that the airlines were saying that they needed the money by that Friday. And there was a strong push to get that package through. And there were commitments to trying to consider, I think, additional legislation, as I recall, that would, in fact, deal with the workers. And that's why it immediately went through. It probably would have been preferable to include it in that package only because, in my experience, you better grab the train that's going through because, if you wait for the next one to leave the station, it may never leave the station. Right now, my understanding is they're going to try to talk about that as part of a stimulus package or perhaps as part of another package going through the Congress. I hope they do. I think it is going to be necessary probably to extend the unemployment compensation program beyond the 26 weeks to try to provide coverage to those employees that have been laid off. I suspect that we're going to probably have to provide some additional support for health care coverage because, very frankly, the COBRA program, which was intended to cover some of those provisions, is very costly. There are probably other ways that we can provide relief as well, but I think we do need to address that package because, very frankly, in a recession and with a down economy, we've got to worry about how we protect people because, in the end, it takes people getting back on their feet to resurrect this economy for the future. Yes, sir.
We have time for two more questions. This PR firm is pushy, but one of their guys wants to ask
You read about the various opinions and various within the constituencies within the White House, Powell, Cheney, Rumsfeld, the role of the chief of staff in dealing with all of that and filtering that to the president, getting the decisions made.
The question was, we read about the different factions, Cheney, Rumsfeld, others that are competing within the White House. The role of the chief of staff in dealing with those kind of competing interests. I have often said that the role of a chief of staff is not so much a management position as a battlefield position. Because you have a mission that you're focusing on for that day, and before you know it, you're taking incoming fire from all directions. And you better damn well be able to handle the different crises that are coming in. The most important challenge right now for the president and for the chief of staff is to get their arms around this crisis. I had to deal with Oklahoma City, which is obviously small compared to what happened here. But in Oklahoma City, the most challenging thing I had to do as chief of staff was to get every agency and every department that had some piece of the action in that investigation to put them in a room in the White House. I put them in the chief of staff's office. And I sat them around the table. And I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? So that everybody knew what was going on. Because the worst thing that can happen is the right hand does not know what the left hand's doing. These are huge problems, and you've got huge departments and huge agencies who always like to do their own thing. Well, I understand that, and they have a role to play. But it's the President of the United States that determines what happens here, not them, President. And so bring that information into the White House, make sure it's being coordinated, and then make sure that the President is properly briefed and makes the final decisions. That is the biggest task right now. Now, I understand they're going to try to do, I think Tom Ridge is going to try to put this home security thing together. And I wish him well. I think he's a good guy. I served with him in the Congress, and I hope he does well. But let me tell you something. If they don't give him authority, if they don't give him budget authority, if he doesn't control in some way the lifeline to some of those departments and agencies, he'll be a great PR person, but he won't be a tough leader that has to deal with security issues. First thing I learned, and I learned it in the Congress, and I certainly learned it in the executive branch, is if you don't have the power of the purse, then you don't have power. Okay?
Very Chicago-esque.
Learned it from him.
Join Saxon, speak very loud.
Yeah, I don't think the mic is live.
That's all right, I'll do it.
Mr. Panetta, you've given us such a wonderful speech. I think maybe we could make some money if they don't have that. Oh, is there any inducement, any job that the bring you back to work?
Hey, I live in Carmel Valley. It's nice to be 3,000 miles away. Listen, let me tell you, I learned something from the first time I went back to Washington and worked for a senator who was another role model. And I'll never forget, he brought legislative assistants into his office, and there was just two of us at the time, Dick. One handled domestic affairs, and the other one handled foreign affairs. Two people on a Senate staff. And he said, you're going to be subject to a lot of temptation. There are people that are going to try to buy you a dinner or lunch and try to get through to me. But remember one thing. You serve the people of California and the people of this country. That's our first interest. And let me tell you something else. In the morning, you got to look at yourself in the mirror. I never forgot that, because basically what that said is integrity is more important than anything else. Your word is more important than anything else. And if you can protect that, that's important. And what I got from that is that in politics, I do politics on a day-to-day basis, which means I do the best in what I'm doing. I just had a group of interns, matter of fact, from our institute that went back to Washington. And I told them, let me tell you something. Most important thing is you do the best in what you're doing. Whether they ask you to open mail or whether they ask you to empty garbage cans, you do the best in that job. And if you do that, other opportunities will come along. And that's what's happened most of my career. And if those opportunities come along, fine. If they don't, I'm having a hell of a good time right now. Thank you.